The hallways of Ridgewood High School thrummed with life as students moved between classes, their voices a blend of laughter, gossip, and the occasional shout. For Michael Thompson, however, these corridors were anything but lively. They were narrow, suffocating passageways where he felt like prey in a world of predators. Every step he took was weighed down by the invisible eyes he felt crawling over him, the whispers he knew were about him, and the laughter that always seemed to follow. As he adjusted the strap of his worn-out backpack, his stomach tightened when he heard the familiar voice that haunted his school days. "Well, well, if it isn't Mikey Tumble," Mark Reynolds called out, his words laced with derision. The sound of his sneakers scuffing the linoleum floor was louder than the commotion around them, a reminder of his dominance in this space. Michael's body tensed as if bracing for impact. He kept his head down, pretending he hadn't heard, even as the laughter from Mark's group swelled. His pace quickened, but it was no use. Mark, the school's star quarterback and self-appointed king of Ridgewood High, never missed a chance to make Michael's life miserable. "Careful there, buddy," Mark sneered as he sidestepped into Michael's path, forcing him to stop abruptly. "Wouldn't want you to fall again, would we?" The hallway erupted into laughter as Mark pantomimed a stumble, his teammates doubling over in exaggerated hilarity. Michael's cheeks burned, the memory of last week's gymnasium humiliation flooding back. Mark had tripped him during a charity basketball game, sending him sprawling onto the court in front of the entire school. His fall wasn't just physical. It was the public degradation that cemented his role as the school's favorite target. "Move, Mark," Michael muttered under his breath, trying to squeeze past. "What was that?" "Speak up, Mikey," Mark said, cupping a hand to his ear mockingly. Michael didn't respond. He clenched his fists tightly at his sides and pushed forward, ducking his head to avoid their jeering faces. The laughter echoed in his ears long after he reached his math classroom and slid into a seat in the far corner, his usual hiding spot. The teacher began the lesson, but Michael barely heard a word. His focus was scattered, broken by the occasional muffled snickers and sidelong glances of classmates. Even the smallest movement, a suppressed giggle, the scrape of a chair, felt like an attack aimed directly at him. The walls seemed to close in, the fluorescent lights too bright, the classroom air too heavy. "Michael," the teacher's voice snapped him out of his spiral. "Pay attention. What's the answer to question 2? His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Heat rose to his face as he fumbled with his textbook, flipping pages aimlessly. "Maybe he fell on his head too hard last week," a voice quipped from the back of the room. The classroom burst into laughter. "That's enough," the teacher said sharply, but the damage was already done. Michael kept his head down, swallowing the lump in his throat, wishing he could disappear. By lunchtime, the weight of the morning had sunk deep into his chest. He carried his tray to his usual spot at the far edge of the cafeteria, away from the chaos of the popular tables. He ate alone, mechanically chewing the sandwich his mother had packed, while his eyes scanned the room instinctively. Across the cafeteria, Mark was surrounded by teammates and admirers, his booming laughter rising above the chatter. Occasionally, Mark's gaze would flicker in Michael's direction, and every time it did, Michael's stomach twisted. When the final bell rang, Michael was the first out of the building. He darted down the school's front steps and into the crisp autumn air, relief washing over him as he left the oppressive hallways behind. The tree-lined streets of Ridgewood were quiet, their calm starkly different from the chaos of the school. His walk home was slow. The short, chubby boy took long, dragging steps, his mind replaying every insult, every laugh, every sneer. He clenched the straps of his backpack as his frustration built. Why couldn't they just leave him alone? What had he done to deserve this constant torment? When he reached his modest two-story home, Michael slipped inside quietly. His mother was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, her cheerful voice calling out, "How was school today, sweetie?" "Fine," Michael replied, forcing his voice to sound normal. He didn't want her to worry. His father was working late again, as usual, and Michael was grateful for the solitude as he retreated to his room. Closing the door behind him, he dropped his bag and flopped onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling. The room was small but comfortable, filled with posters of action movies and books stacked haphazardly on the shelves. He turned his head toward the mirror on his dresser, his reflection catching his eye. He saw himself, his round face, his messy brown hair, his broad frame. But more than that, he saw the defeat etched into his features. The slumped shoulders, the downturned eyes, the heavy sighs. "Why me?" he whispered. It was a question he had asked himself countless times. What was it about him that drew their cruelty? He had no answers, only the weight of their scorn pressing down on him like an invisible hand. But as Michael sat up, his reflection seemed to change. The sadness was still there, but beneath it, a flicker of something else, a faint, smoldering ember. Anger. Not just at Mark or the other students, but at himself for letting this continue. He stood and approached the mirror, gripping the edges of the dresser. "Enough," he said softly, the word trembling but firm. "Enough." Michael didn't know what he would do or how he would change, but in that moment, a decision was made. He couldn't keep living like this. He couldn't let Mark, or anyone else, dictate how he felt about himself. He was tired of being a spectator in his own life. With a deep breath, he stared into his own eyes, the ember inside him glowing a little brighter. "I don't know how," he said aloud, "but this ends now." As he turned away from the mirror, Michael felt a small but powerful shift within him. It was just the beginning of what he knew would be a long, difficult road. But for the first time in years, he had taken a step forward. And that was enough for now. The rain came down in sheets, drenching the quiet streets of Ridgewood and reducing visibility to mere feet. The gray sky hung heavy, casting a somber mood over the suburb as storm drains struggled to keep up with the relentless downpour. Michael Thompson pulled his hood tighter over his head as he walked home from the public library, the bag slung over his shoulder bouncing slightly with every step. He had spent the last few hours poring over self-help books and motivational articles, hoping to spark ideas for the change he knew he needed. His sneakers splashed through shallow puddles as he turned the corner onto a flooded street. The air smelled of wet earth and pavement, mingling with the faint metallic tang of the rain. As Michael neared the intersection, a loud honk startled him. He froze, his eyes darting to the source, a sleek black car, stuck in the middle of a rapidly rising pool of water. The engine sputtered as the driver repeatedly tried to restart it. Inside the car, a family of 3 was clearly distressed. The man behind the wheel jabbed at his phone, likely trying to call for help, while a woman in the passenger seat gestured frantically at the water outside. In the back seat, a small child pressed her face against the window, her wide eyes filled with fear. Michael's heart clenched at the sight. "Hey, you need help," he called out, his voice barely cutting through the roar of the rain. The driver rolled down the window a crack, rain immediately splattering inside. "The car's stuck. The water's too high, and it's flooding the engine," he shouted, his voice thick with frustration and panic. "We can't move it." Michael hesitated for only a moment before making his decision. He shoved his bag onto the driest patch of pavement he could find and waded into the water. The cold shocked him, soaking through his jeans in seconds as it reached mid-thigh. The rain was relentless, pounding against him as he pushed forward. "Put it in neutral," he shouted to the driver. "I'll push from the back." The man hesitated, clearly unsure if this teenager could make a difference, but desperation won out. He shifted the car into neutral and looked back. Michael braced his hands against the trunk, the frigid water swirling around his legs. He dug his heels into the slick asphalt and pushed with all his might. The car groaned, its tires spinning uselessly for a moment before finally gaining some traction. Inch by inch, it began to move. The effort was immense. Every muscle in Michael's body screamed in protest as he leaned into the task. His soaked hoodie clung to him like a second skin, adding weight to his already exhausting labor. The rain blurred his vision, and the cold numbed his fingers, but he didn't stop. "Keep going," the driver urged from inside, his voice muffled but urgent. Michael gritted his teeth, his determination overpowering the ache in his arms and legs. With one final heave, the car rolled onto a slightly elevated stretch of road, away from the worst of the water. Michael staggered back, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He wiped rain from his face, his hands trembling from the cold and exertion. The driver jumped out of the car, an umbrella snapping open in his hand. "Hey, kid," That was incredible. Thank you, he said, his gratitude evident even through his shock. Michael waved him off, still catching his breath. It's fine. Just glad you're safe. As the driver opened the back door to check on his child, the woman stepped out, offering Michael a small, dry towel from the car. You're soaked, she said, her voice warm with concern. Please, take this. Michael hesitated before accepting it. Thanks, he murmured, wiping his face and arms. The kindness felt foreign, almost uncomfortable, after years of being treated as invisible or worse. Wait a second, the driver said suddenly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Michael's face. I know you. You go to Ridgewood High, don't you? Michael froze, his stomach sinking. He glanced at the man again, and the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. It was Mark Reynolds's father. He had seen him at football games, always standing proudly on the sidelines. The resemblance was undeniable, the same sharp jawline, the same piercing eyes. Michael's breath caught as he realized the little girl in the back seat was likely Mark's younger sister. For a moment, Michael considered walking away, pretending he hadn't heard. But before he could move, the back door opened again, and out stepped Mark himself. He had been hidden from view, likely sitting in the seat behind his mother. His varsity jacket was already soaked as he emerged, his usual confident smirk absent, replaced by a rare expression of disbelief. The two boys locked eyes, the rain continuing to pour around them. You, Mark said, his voice low, almost incredulous. What are you doing here? Michael felt the familiar sting of shame rise in his chest, but this time it was accompanied by something stronger, defiance. Helping your family, he replied evenly. Looks like no one else was around. Mark's face twisted, as though grappling with conflicting emotions. His father glanced between them, clearly sensing the tension but saying nothing. After a beat, Mark muttered, "Thanks. I guess." Michael stared at him for a long moment, searching for any hint of sincerity. Finally, he gave a small nod. "You're welcome." He turned away without another word, retrieving his bag from the sidewalk and pulling his hood back up. As he walked away, his wet shoes squelching with every step, his mind raced. The encounter had left him shaken, but there was also a sense of triumph. For once, he had been in a position of strength, and Mark Reynolds, had needed his help. Mark watched Michael disappear into the rain, his jaw tight and his fists clenched. The dynamic between them had shifted, however slightly, and it unnerved him. Michael's act of selflessness gnawed at him, forcing him to confront a truth he wasn't ready to face. Perhaps Michael Thompson wasn't as weak as he had always believed. Michael, on the other hand, walked home with a new sense of resolve. He hadn't helped for recognition or revenge. He had helped because it was the right thing to do. And for the first time in years, he felt powerful in his own skin, not because of what he had done for Mark, but because of the strength he had found within himself. The buzz of fluorescent lights hummed softly as Michael Thompson stood just inside the doorway of the small, unassuming martial arts gym. The scent of sweat and disinfectant hung in the air, mingling with the rhythmic sounds of bodies hitting mats and the occasional sharp bark of an instructor's voice. Michael's heart raced, not from exertion but from apprehension. He gripped the straps of his backpack tightly, his palms damp as he took in the sight of students grappling on the mats, their movements precise and deliberate. He had spent hours researching online before finally gathering the courage to step into the gym. The stories he read about jiu-jitsu's transformative power had inspired him. It wasn't about brute strength, they said, but about technique, discipline, and resilience, qualities Michael felt he desperately needed. Still, standing here now, he couldn't shake the doubt gnawing at the edges of his resolve. "Can I help you?" The voice startled him, pulling him from his thoughts. Michael turned to see a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a calm, authoritative presence. He wore a simple black GI, and the ease in his posture hinted at years of experience. His warm smile softened the intensity of his gaze. Yeah, Michael stammered. I'm here to ask about the beginner classes." The man's smile widened as he extended a hand. "John Carter," he said. "Head instructor here. Welcome." Michael shook his hand, the man's grip firm but not intimidating. "I'm Michael. I'm not. I don't have any experience or anything." "That's exactly why we have beginner classes," John said with a chuckle. "Come on, let me show you around." Michael followed him deeper into the gym, his nerves easing slightly with each step. John explained the fundamentals of jiu-jitsu as they walked, emphasizing the importance of patience and perseverance. "It's not just about learning to defend yourself," John said. "It's about learning to control yourself, your body, your mind, your emotions." They stopped near the edge of the mat where a group of students was practicing. Michael watched as one student executed a smooth armbar, their movements fluid and controlled. It was almost mesmerizing, the way they combined strategy and technique to overcome their partner's resistance. "You can start with an introductory class," John said, snapping Michael out of his thoughts. "Get a feel for it. See if it's something you want to pursue." Michael nodded, his earlier hesitation giving way to a flicker of determination. "Okay, I'll try it." The first class was grueling. Michael stepped onto the mat wearing a borrowed GI that was slightly too big, his movements awkward and hesitant. He felt painfully aware of his size and lack of coordination as he fumbled through the warm-ups, sweat already dripping down his face. The other students, ranging from wiry teens to middle-aged adults, moved with a confidence that only deepened his self-consciousness. But to his surprise, no one laughed or sneered. Instead, they offered encouragement, helping him adjust his stance or guiding him through a drill. It was a stark contrast to the ridicule he had grown used to. "Take it slow," John said as he demonstrated a basic guard pass. "It's not about doing it perfectly on the first try. It's about understanding the mechanics. Focus on small improvements." Michael nodded, trying to absorb the advice. His first attempts were clumsy, his body refusing to cooperate with the unfamiliar motions. Each time he failed, he felt a surge of frustration, but John's calm voice kept him grounded. "Good. Now try again." By the end of the class, Michael was exhausted, his muscles aching in ways he hadn't known they could. He sat on the edge of the mat, gulping water and wiping sweat from his brow. Despite the physical strain, there was a strange sense of accomplishment buzzing in his chest. He had stumbled and fallen, many times, but he had also gotten back up. Over the next few weeks, Michael threw himself into training. The initial soreness gave way to a growing sense of strength and agility as he began to understand the techniques. He learned to anticipate his partner's movements, to think several steps ahead, and to remain calm under pressure. Each session pushed him to his limits, but it also revealed a resilience he hadn't realized he possessed. The gym became a sanctuary, a place where he could shed the weight of judgment and focus entirely on his own growth. The camaraderie among the students was unlike anything he had experienced before. They celebrated each other's progress, no matter how small, and encouraged perseverance in the face of challenges. One evening, as Michael practiced a chokehold with a partner, John watched from the sidelines, nodding approvingly. "You're getting the hang of it, Michael," he said. "Remember, it's not about overpowering your opponent. It's about using their energy against them." Michael grinned, sweat dripping down his face. "Thanks, coach. I think I'm starting to get it." The lessons extended beyond the mat. Michael found himself approaching his schoolwork with more focus, his mind clearer and more disciplined. He started speaking up in class, his voice steady where it once wavered. Even the hallways of Ridgewood High felt less oppressive as he walked through them with his head held higher. But the most profound change was internal. For the first time, Michael felt a sense of control over his life. The taunts and jeers that once crushed him now seemed smaller, less significant. He was no longer defined by the opinions of others, but by his own determination to grow. One Friday evening, as he packed up his gear after class, John approached him. "Michael, I've been meaning to tell you, your progress these past weeks has been impressive. You've got a good mindset for this." Michael felt a swell of pride, his chest tightening with emotion. "Thank you," he said. I really needed this." John clapped him on the shoulder. "Keep at it. You're stronger than you think." As Michael stepped out into the cool night air, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. His journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. And he was ready to face whatever came next. Mark Reynolds leaned against the bleachers at Ridgewood High's football field, his jaw tight and his gaze distant. Practice had ended an hour ago, but he lingered, clutching a football in one hand and spinning it absently. The air was thick with the faint smell of freshly cut grass and the hum of crickets in the evening quiet. Yet Mark's mind was far from the familiar comfort of the field. It had been weeks since the rainstorm, weeks since Michael Thompson had appeared out of nowhere to help his family. The image of Michael, drenched and shivering but resolute as he pushed their car out of rising floodwaters, had seared itself into Mark's memory. It didn't make sense. Why would someone like Michael, someone he had tormented for years, show such selflessness? The question gnawed at him in a way he couldn't shake. At school, Mark had tried to push the thought aside, burying himself in the usual rhythm of football and social dominance. But his grip on his throne felt less secure now, the cracks in his confidence widening with every passing day. The world around him seemed to shift imperceptibly, as though he were no longer the center of gravity he'd always believed himself to be. "Yo, Mark," a teammate called from across the field, jolting him from his thoughts. "We're heading out. Pizza at Joe's. You coming?" Mark shook his head. "Not tonight," he replied, his voice flat. He tossed the football onto the bench and grabbed his bag, his movements heavy with frustration. He needed space, a break from the facade he wore like armor. Later that evening, Mark found himself scrolling through his phone aimlessly, the glow of the screen illuminating his bedroom. His feed was filled with the usual: sports highlights, selfies from classmates, and memes. But one post caught his attention, a picture of Michael at a martial arts gym, his face red and sweaty, his GI slightly askew. The caption read, "Another day, another step forward. #no limits." Mark stared at the photo, his brow furrowing. He couldn't reconcile the Michael in the picture with the one he had known. This Michael looked confident, even determined. There was a fire in his eyes that Mark had never noticed before. The next day, curiosity got the better of him. After school, instead of heading home, Mark drove to the address he had seen tagged in the post. The gym was modest, tucked between a laundromat and a hardware store, its sign barely visible. Through the glass front, Mark could see a handful of students sparring on the mats, their movements fluid and focused. He hesitated, debating whether to step inside or turn back. But before he could decide, the door swung open, and a tall, gray-haired man in a black GI stepped out. "You looking for something, son?" the man asked, his tone friendly but firm. No. I mean, kind of," Mark stammered, caught off guard. "I'm just checking the place out." The man studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Name's John. I'm the head instructor here. You interested in jiu-jitsu?" Mark scratched the back of his neck, feeling awkward under John's steady gaze. "I guess. I've heard about it. From someone I know." "Well, why don't you come in and watch a session? Get a feel for what we do," John suggested, stepping aside to hold the door open. Mark nodded reluctantly and followed him in. The atmosphere was far removed from the structured chaos of football practice. It was quiet, almost meditative, despite the grunts and thuds of bodies hitting the mats. Students of all shapes and sizes moved with intent, their interactions marked by a level of respect that felt foreign to Mark. And then he saw him. Michael was mid-roll, locked in a grappling match with a taller, more experienced partner. Sweat dripped from his brow as he twisted and maneuvered, his face a mask of concentration. Mark's eyes widened as Michael executed a sweep, reversing their positions and gaining the upper hand. The other students clapped lightly, murmuring encouragement. Mark felt a strange mix of emotions watching Michael: admiration, envy, and something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. This wasn't the timid, awkward kid he had mocked. This was someone who had found a strength that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. After the session ended, Michael stood by the edge of the mat, sipping water and chatting with a few of his training partners. Mark lingered near the entrance, unsure if he wanted to be seen. But before he could slip away, Michael's eyes met his. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Michael walked over, a towel draped around his neck. "What are you doing here?" Michael asked, his tone cautious but not hostile. Mark hesitated, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "I saw your post. Thought I'd check it out." Michael raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Really? Just curious, or something else?" Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Look, I don't know. I just wanted to see what you were doing. Why you're different." Michael studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the mats. "That's why. It's not just about the fighting. It's about learning to control yourself, to face things head-on. You should try it sometime." The suggestion caught Mark off guard. "Me? I don't think." "You're here, aren't you?" Michael interrupted. "Maybe you're already looking for something." Mark didn't have a response to that. He looked around the gym again, the camaraderie and determination in the air palpable. For the first time, he felt a flicker of uncertainty about the path he had been walking. "I'll think about it," Mark said finally. Michael shrugged, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Up to you. But if you do, be ready to get your ass handed to you. It happens to all of us." Mark couldn't help but chuckle, the tension between them easing slightly. "I'll keep that in mind." As Mark left the gym, his thoughts were a whirlwind. He had come seeking answers, but all he found were more questions. About Michael, about himself, and about what kind of person he wanted to be. For the first time, the pedestal he had placed himself on didn't feel so steady. And deep down, he wondered if that was exactly what he needed. The transformation was subtle at first, a ripple in the once predictable tides of Ridgewood High. Michael Thompson, once the object of mockery and whispers, was no longer shuffling through the hallways with his head down. Instead, he walked with purpose. His shoulders, once perpetually hunched, were now squared with a quiet confidence that seemed to demand attention. It wasn't that Michael sought the spotlight, far from it. But the way he carried himself now was impossible to ignore. His classmates began to notice, their conversations shifting from mocking his every move to speculating about his change. The boy they had teased relentlessly no longer reacted to their taunts. The usual jabs about his weight or clumsiness were met with indifference, a calm that unnerved even his most persistent tormentors. Mark Reynolds watched these changes unfold from a distance. In the weeks since their encounter at the gym, Mark had avoided direct confrontation with Michael, unsure of how to navigate this new dynamic. For the first time, Mark found himself questioning his place in the social hierarchy he had dominated for so long. If someone like Michael could break free of his assigned role, what did that mean for the rest of them? The shift in Michael's demeanor was not confined to the hallways. In class, he began to raise his hand, asking thoughtful questions and contributing to discussions with an ease that surprised even his teachers. His confidence was contagious. Other students who had once been content to fade into the background found themselves speaking up, inspired by his example. One afternoon, as Michael was packing his books after a history lesson, a small group of classmates approached him. They hovered awkwardly, exchanging glances before one of them, a tall boy named Ryan, spoke up. "Hey, Michael," Ryan began, his voice hesitant. "We were, wondering about that gym you go to. The jiu-jitsu place." Michael glanced up, his brow furrowed in surprise. "What about it?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. "It seems interesting," Ryan admitted, scratching the back of his neck. "We've noticed, how you've changed. It's cool. We were thinking maybe we'd check it out." Michael blinked, taken aback. The idea of his peers, some of whom had laughed at him mere months ago, now seeking his guidance felt surreal. But he nodded, his voice steady. "Yeah, you should. It's not just about fighting. It's about learning to push yourself. To grow." Ryan and the others nodded, their initial awkwardness fading. "Do they let beginners try a class for free?" one of them asked. "Yeah," Michael replied with a faint smile. "Tell them I sent you. They'll set you up." Over the next few weeks, a ripple became a wave. More and more students began visiting the gym, drawn by the stories of Michael's transformation and the camaraderie they had heard about. The gym's atmosphere, welcoming, disciplined, and focused, contrasted sharply with the competitive and often toxic environment of a high school. The ripple effect didn't stop there. Conversations in the school corridors began to shift. Where gossip and petty rivalries had once dominated, there were now discussions about goals, training techniques, and even mindfulness. Students who had never interacted before found common ground in their shared struggles on the mats. The gym became a neutral space where titles, popularity, and cliques faded, leaving only the universal drive to improve. Teachers noticed the changes too. One day, during a staff meeting, the school's principal brought it up. "Have any of you noticed the decrease in disciplinary issues lately?" she asked, glancing around the room. "Particularly among students who've had, shall we say, colorful records?" Several teachers nodded, exchanging knowing looks. "I've seen it," said Mr. Carter, the history teacher. "A lot of them seem more focused. Even Mark Reynolds has been quieter lately." "Quieter?" another teacher asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's a first." The staff chuckled, but the principal's expression remained thoughtful. "Whatever's happening, it's working," she said. "Let's keep an eye on it." Meanwhile, Michael's transformation caught the attention of the school's guidance counselor, Mrs. Fields. She invited him to her office one afternoon, her tone curious but kind. "Michael, I've been hearing a lot of positive things about you lately," she said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "What's changed?" Michael hesitated, unsure how to articulate the journey he had been on. I just decided I didn't want to feel powerless anymore," he said finally. "Jiu-jitsu helped with that. It's not just about learning to fight. It's about learning to handle pressure, to stay calm. It's helped me find myself, I guess." Mrs. Field smiled, her eyes warm. "That's a powerful realization," she said. "You've not only changed yourself but inspired others. That's something to be proud of." Despite the positive changes, not everyone embraced the new dynamic. A few students clung to the old ways, their insecurities making them resistant to the shift. One afternoon, during lunch, Michael overheard a group mocking his newfound confidence. "Think he's better than us now, just because he knows how to roll around on a mat," one sneered, their voice dripping with jealousy. Michael turned toward them, his expression calm but firm. "It's not about being better than anyone," he said evenly. "It's about being better than who I used to be." The group fell silent, their mockery dissolving under the weight of his words. Michael didn't wait for a response. He picked up his tray and walked away, leaving them to stew in their discomfort. As the weeks turned into months, Ridgewood High began to feel like a different place. The culture of fear and mockery that had once defined it was giving way to something new, a culture of respect and self-improvement. Michael's journey had sparked a movement, one that showed no signs of slowing down. Even Mark Reynolds, who had once been the embodiment of the old ways, found himself questioning everything he had built his identity on. Watching Michael's steady rise forced Mark to confront the emptiness of his own victories. For the first time, he wondered if the strength he had always prided himself on was the wrong kind entirely. Mark wasn't ready to admit it yet, not to Michael, not to anyone, but deep down, he knew that change was inevitable. And maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what he needed. The crisp morning air of Ridgewood High's courtyard carried a sense of change, as if the atmosphere itself had shifted along with the students who now walked its halls. Michael Thompson stood near the edge of the courtyard, his backpack slung over one shoulder as he stared out at the bustling scene before him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to shrink into the shadows or avoid eye contact. The whispers that used to follow him had been replaced with nods of acknowledgement and even a few smiles. As he was about to head inside, a voice called out from behind him. "Michael, can we talk?" Turning, Michael saw Mark Reynolds standing a few feet away, his hands jammed into the pockets of his varsity jacket. His usual cocky demeanor was absent, replaced by something quieter, almost hesitant. Michael paused, studying him for a moment before nodding. "Sure," he said, his tone measured. "What's on your mind?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Not here," he muttered. "Let's walk." Michael hesitated but eventually followed as Mark led them toward the far corner of the courtyard, away from the main flow of students. Once they were out of earshot, Mark stopped and turned to face him. "Look," Mark began, his voice low but steady. "I owe you an apology. For everything." Michael raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Everything." "For the years of crap I put you through," Mark said, meeting his eyes. "I've been a total jerk. And I know it doesn't erase what I did, but I'm sorry." The sincerity in Mark's voice caught Michael off guard. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was here, it didn't feel triumphant or vindicating. Instead, it felt complicated. "Why now?" Michael asked, crossing his arms. "Why are you telling me this?" Mark exhaled slowly, looking down at his feet. "Because I've been thinking a lot about what kind of person I want to be. And honestly, seeing you, how you've changed, how you've handled everything, I realized I've been wasting my time trying to tear people down when I should have been working on myself." Michael regarded him silently, the weight of Mark's words sinking in. Finally, he spoke. "Apology accepted. But if you really mean it, show me. Be better." Mark nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "I will. And I was wondering if you'd help me. You know, with the jiu-jitsu stuff." Michael's eyebrows shot up. "You want to train?" "Yeah," Mark said, his voice firm. "I've been thinking about it since I saw you at the gym. I think it's something I need." Michael considered him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But it's not easy. You're going to get your ass handed to you at first." Mark cracked a small smile. "I think I can handle it." That afternoon, they walked into the gym together, drawing a few surprised looks from the regulars. John Carter raised an eyebrow as he saw the pair approach. "Well, this is new," he said, crossing his arms. "You bringing in recruits now, Michael?" Michael smirked. "Something like that. Mark wants to give it a try." John studied Mark for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's see what you've got." The first session was as humbling as Michael had promised. Mark, accustomed to being the strongest and fastest on the football field, quickly realized that jiu-jitsu was an entirely different challenge. He was taken down repeatedly, his strength rendered useless against the precise techniques of even the smaller students. By the end of the session, he was drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. But he didn't quit. Instead, he got back on the mat, determined to learn. And Michael, to his own surprise, found himself cheering Mark on, offering pointers and encouragement where he could. The dynamic between them began to shift, the hostility that had defined their relationship slowly giving way to mutual respect. As the weeks passed, their partnership on the mat grew stronger. Mark's progress was steady, though not without setbacks, and Michael found himself impressed by his persistence. Outside the gym, their newfound camaraderie began to extend into the halls of Ridgewood High. They weren't exactly friends, not yet, but the tension between them had dissolved, replaced by a tentative understanding. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. The ripple effect Michael had started continued to grow, and now Mark was part of it. Together, they began to inspire others, proving that change was possible, even for those who had once seemed the least likely to embrace it. One afternoon, as they sat on the gym floor after a particularly grueling session, Mark turned to Michael. "You know," he said, his tone thoughtful, "I used to think strength was about being on top. About making sure no one could knock you down. And now?" Michael asked, wiping sweat from his face. Mark smiled faintly. "Now I think it's about getting back up. No matter how many times you fall." Michael nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Took you long enough." The two laughed, the sound echoing through the gym. It wasn't just a laugh, it was the sound of something new being built. Something better. By the end of the school year, the changes at Ridgewood High were undeniable. The culture of bullying that had once dominated was a shadow of its former self, replaced by an atmosphere of respect and growth. Students looked to Michael and Mark, not as heroes, but as examples of what was possible when people chose to face their challenges head-on. For Michael, the journey had been about finding his own strength. For Mark, It had been about discovering humility. Together, they had shown their peers that the past didn't have to define them, and that even the most broken relationships could be mended. As they stood together at graduation, their names called one after the other, the applause that followed wasn't just for two individuals. It was for the transformation they had sparked, not just in themselves, but in everyone around them.
If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.